Hello, and welcome to another Oki Solo Channel YouTube video. So assuming nothing weird happens in the next few days, this video will be coming out on December 12th. And December 12th is a pretty significant day for me because that marks the anniversary of when Keiko died back in 2003. You might notice on my bookshelf I have a couple random books, and I actually even still collect random Keiko paraphernalia. I was really big into following that story when I was younger, and it really raised this, this interest in trying to figure out, what is best for these animals. And these, for me, has expanded over the years, as included the fish that I take care of, the animals I work with in biomedical research. My entire life is focused around animal husbandry. And so a certain topic in animal husbandry has become very popular and very topical, and it's referring to cetacean sanctuaries. And I think we should talk about it a little bit because a lot of people present these sanctuaries as this simple, you build a sea pen, you put the animals in it, and it'll be better than any tank they've ever been in. And I just don't think it's that simple. So I actually wanted to take a step back and talk about there are animal husbandry is an ever-evolving field. So you can find textbooks like this. A fun fact, a lot of the books on this shelf are actually gifts from my father over the years. But in Wild Mammals in Captivity was when I was first introduced to the concept of the 5 freedoms. Yeah. So anyways, this book introduced me to the concept of the 5 freedoms. So freedom from injury and disease, freedom from hunger, thirst, and malnutrition, freedom from thermal physical distress, freedom to express most normal behaviors, and freedom from fear. And this was an idea that was first fielded in the 1960s. And as you can tell, today we've and we'll talk about it in depth later, specifically referring to the 5 domains of animal husbandry. But I just wanted to use that to give a lot of context of that, animal husbandry is a topic near and dear to my heart. And it's been in every facet of my life from when I was a child, trying to follow the story of this specific animal that I really wanted to see released into the wild, to the career path and my hobbies today. And I think that's very important going forward because I think I'm going to be critical of some ideas that people are presenting when it comes to cetacean sanctuaries. And I want to be very clear that I'm coming from a place of I care about the animals' welfare, and I very much want them to be taken care of in the best possible way. So let's crack into it. I think the most recent example of how this has been playing out in the public eye is the National Aquarium in Baltimore's journey to move their animals, their dolphins, from the pool complex they're in now into a sanctuary. They actually originally announced the plan in 2016, and so it's been almost 10 years, and a lot of people look at it and they're like, oh my god, they have done absolutely nothing, they've gone nowhere, and it was all just a publicity stunt. And I think, to be fair, we need to stop and say, well, it's logistically really complicated to do this. Again, I mentioned earlier, people assume that you can just build a pen and it'll be fine, but these pens don't have the control of an aquarium complex where you can control the environmental and stuff. You can't control for red tides, you can't control for hurricanes, you can't control for boat traffic outside of these pens. You can't that has been a problem that has run into every project to date so far. So I don't blame the National Aquarium in Baltimore for being a little cautious. And just to give a few examples right off the top of my head, the Sea Life Trust the Sea Life Trust actually had to remove their whales from their pen for a while because one of their contractors' boats sank and started leaking petrol and oil into the surrounding environment, and it made it unsafe for them. During Keiko's tenure in Iceland, actually in the same region that the Sea Life Trust is in now, there was demolition work being done, and they actually had to move the whale away because they didn't want, take him on a walk as far away as they could, just so that they weren't, the whale wasn't exposed to the loud noise of explosives, So these are picking your spot is really, really difficult. And building these facilities is also incredibly difficult. The Whale Sanctuary Project in Nova Scotia estimates that their sanctuary, when completed, will be somewhere between $12 and $15 million. And the Orca Network, they worked very hard for a long time to try and get Tukite, also known as Lolita, Tukite released into a sanctuary, and they estimated that just moving her from Miami to the Salmon Islands would have been about $200,000, and maintaining her for the first year would have been about $1.5 million. So these aren't cheap, easy projects. These are very in-depth, and so every project to date has had these weird setbacks. So putting a lot of forward thinking before you start breaking ground will save you a lot of headaches later on. So I can't blame the National Aquarium in Baltimore for taking their time trying to pick a location. I really wanted to spend time talking about the National Aquarium in Baltimore because I think a lot of people look at projects like that, and I'm going to keep honing this in, keep looking at projects like that and what the Whale Sanctuary Project and Sea Life Trust are doing, and seem to think it's a really simple solution. And I think we need to step back and admit that it's not. And part of why it's not a easy solution is, and we screwed up really hard by bringing killer whales, beluga whales, and dolphins into captivity. And so that means that when, much like with relationships with people, trying to mend relationships when you've screwed up really hard, it takes work and it's not easy. And so I think we need to stop looking for these simple solutions and start delving into some of these questions and trying to answer them with adequate answers. I have my laptop just off screen here. So the Global Federation for Animal Sanctuaries recently, I think in 2023, produced a bunch of standards in collaboration with the National Aquarium, the Whale Sanctuary Project, and Sea Life Trust. And I want to talk about some of these standards that they have proposed and work through them a little bit. The first thing is they want the main purpose to be around conservation and less around entertainment, XYZ. I don't have a lot to say about that. I think that's fine. The next one is they want to reduce interactions with the public and also interactions with trainers. And even it seems to me, at least in many situations, they think it's actually desirable for them to get their socialization from other cetaceans and native flora and fauna, and not from humans, regardless of whether they're caretakers or not. That is my interpretation of what I've seen around it, and we'll talk about that later. They also say that ethically that they should not be breeding, and this raises because the goal is to end captivity for cetaceans in the long term. Okay, so we've established those standards, at least some of the standards that they've proposed. And there's a couple glaring holes for me here. The first one is they don't really seem to have an emphasis on how to obtain funding. And that's problematic to me because, so we're going to go back to the Keiko thing. One of the things that really stood out to me about the Keiko project is that I think they were averaging somewhere around expenses being around $300,000 a month. And like through time, this project ended up being a lot more like people really thought that like if we brought him into the wild, that would be the hard part, and then like he might take the initiative himself and start leading and trying to like we might have to hold him back so that he like before he was ready, and that ended up not being what happened at all. So the project was much longer, much harder, and required much more time than anyone expected. And if you've ever worked in any environment where you're doing like work, the most expensive thing is paying for people's time. And so like through time you actually saw that who was leading the project changed hands. It was the Free Willy Keiko Foundation for a while, and then it was I think it was Michel Cousteau's society for a while, and then it was like, and then they left. Like everyone was not prepared for how long and expensive this project was going to be, and so I think having like this set out plan for how to get funding is really important because, for example, Sea Life Trust advertises that they're spending about $45,000 a month on 2 beluga whales, which are 2 fairly small cetaceans. And I already mentioned the statistics for what Orca Network thought it would cost for Tokite. I think the whale sanctuary is estimating a yearly annual cost of like around $1.5 million once they have animals. And I'm actually going to bring up a book that I don't think gets talked about enough in this field when it comes to talking about killer whales in captivity and whether or not they belong there. But this is my copy of Beneath the Surface by John Hargrove. In this case, he also makes a legitimate argument that the people who are most, what's the word I'm looking for? The people that are most capable, they have the most resources in order to do right by these animals are actually the people who currently own these animals, because like in the case of like SeaWorld and their killer whales, they produce more revenue than anyone else in the world who owns killer whales. And so they have the resources and the revenue stream to actually produce these like better husbandry models and actually afford them through long time. And like that's another one of those unfortunate realities where I'm like, maybe the solution, and this is just me like talking from the hip here, but like maybe the solution actually is that we need to find a way to get SeaWorld to, like, instead of trying to find a way to get SeaWorld to let go of their animals, but allow them to retain possession of them and like monotonize them in a way that like we're much more willing to compromise with than their current situations, because like the funding thing is actually a really big deal, and that's something that's been in my head for a long time, years if not decades, when it comes to these sort of projects, because they're just not cheap. And I actually recently took the time to read The Cetacean Sanctuary, A Sea of Unknowns by Jason Bruck. And I anticipate that a lot of people who tell me that I read this are going to be like, oh, don't listen to that guy. He's super biased. He does research on captive dolphins. Like I agree with all of that. I think you're right. But that doesn't mean that that's an ad hominem. Like that doesn't mean he isn't capable of producing legitimate criticisms. And actually within his paper, I think he does raise a couple good points that I don't think the current standards for cetacean sanctuaries have adequately answered. And one of them is actually, and I can't believe I didn't think of this myself, to be honest, but one of them he brings up is that the idea of not breeding has certain solutions in existence in the field right now, and it's either putting the animals on birth control or sexually segregating them. And that, let's talk about those in turn. So putting them on birth control, we are aware of in people that, and in cetaceans, that putting long-term effects of long-term exposure to these like estrogenic type hormone therapies actually does have effects. And anecdotally, this is not like for sure, but anecdotally, it does seem that animals that are on these medications do actually seem to have differences in behavior, and these behaviors sometimes seem to make them, and this is why it's anecdotal, it's hard to measure this sort of thing. They seem more irritable, they seem more prone to picking fights with other dolphins. So maybe that's not the best solution. And the next layer is sexually segregating, which presents its own problems, because like, let's talk about dolphins specifically. These are very sexual animals. It's like their entire basis, their society and social arrangement is these very promiscuous relationships with a myriad of partners, and limiting that actually could reduce welfare. Like, it would reduce their sense of like connection with their own species, and that actually has welfare implications, because we'll get into it later, but one of the domains is like mental states. And so it's like, that would be a big problem if we're changing their social arrangements in a way that is unnatural to them. I get that the counter argument is that a lot of them are in captivity, so their social arrangements are already unnatural, but like, just think it through. Like, we are reducing their choices if we start sexually segregating them, and I'll get to it more later. But an important principle to me in animal welfare is the idea that the animals have choice. But he also goes on to argue that one of the things that we haven't thought about is a lot of these cetacean societies are actually based around the care and rearing of juveniles. And there is actually evidence and hard data that cetacean social groupings that have juveniles in them actually display a more diverse set of behaviors, because they have the full, social repertoire at their disposal. And so like, by removing the ability for these animals to choose to have offspring, like, we might actually be reducing their welfare and sense of well-being, because they seem to have a drive to want to do that. And that's not always the case. So there is always exceptions. Well, like San Diego SeaWorld, Orchid, she seems completely unwilling to have children. And given anecdotal evidence from trainers and everyone, I do think that's an actual choice for this animal. And so I think it's important to say that like, they are capable of choosing, and maybe that's something we need to think about very seriously before we take that away from them. And I think a lot of this boils down to that people are really stuck in the quote-unquote natural fallacy. And that's this idea that like, because it's the natural state, it's better for the animal. And that's not necessarily true. The one that keeps sitting in my head is that Nami, a killer whale that was kept in, I think it was the Teiji Whale Museum, she was in a netted off lagoon pen environment. And when she died, she was found to have, like, I think it was 491 stones, equaling up to around 180 pounds. And that presented her actual like welfare problems, and as near as we can figure, she was just bored, and so she was eating stones in much the same way that like a lot of SeaWorld's whales, when they're bored, they chew on the sides of the tanks and stuff like that. So boredom is still present in this environment. The whole like natural rhythms of their environment, that's a phrasing I see everywhere, doesn't seem to have as much sway for these animals as a lot of us seem to think they innately would have. And I think thinking it through, that actually kind of makes sense. These are incredibly intelligent animals, and so that would probably mean that they are less instinctual and more learned animals than we would, than the average animal in the world, you know what I mean? And so maybe we need to put a larger emphasis on their learned state. And so like this is me bringing it back around to Keiko and why I started off with him. One of the things that was like really crazy to me and really intriguing, and like as I got older and thought more and more about the implications of it, and I got more like in the world of animal husbandry, is that he had the entire ocean at his disposal, and he wanted nothing more than to be in the presence of humans. And he had spent decades in the care of man, and so like for him, human socialization was a positive reinforcing thing. And like he had spent, I think it was 16 years away from the company of other killer whales. He was very shy and fearful. These were things that were like that were foreign to him. And like, that was another one of those, like, we screwed this animal up so bad, he doesn't know how to socialize with his own kind anymore. So there was a quote in Jason Bruck's paper that I think is really important to think about. And I have it up on my laptop here. It says, "We simply cannot assume that just because the ancestors of zoo-housed cetaceans lived and succeeded in the wild, that captive-born and long-term captive whales will succeed in sanctuaries. We know that the wild is not ideal for these animals, and moving managed animals closer to a wild environment should not be taken lightly. Regulators and the public should ask the tough questions to spur the research necessary to determine if housing cetaceans in sanctuaries will work." And I think that's something that I really wanted more people who are advocating for these sanctuaries to ask these questions, because I think a lot of these people are not, I think a lot of these sanctuaries aren't being held to a standard that they really should be. Because sanctuaries are seen as this better than tanks option, I think a lot of people are too willing to allow these people to move without transparency and stuff like that. So like, for example, the Whale Sanctuary Project, they have been touting that they're ready to do animals. They're like working very hard to get the marine land in France killer whales into a sanctuary, but there's a couple problems there, and that I'm like, you're really rushing this, is that they have picked a site that requires all the neighboring people in it to consent to this type of project. That's just apparently how the regulations work in Nova Scotia. And so far, and they've been working on this project, and I don't know how long they've been looking at this site, but they've been working on this project for 9 years. And so far they've gotten 2 out of the 5 neighbors to consent to this. So they don't even have the paperwork involved in a row in order to have these animals. And like, the majority of their budgets right now is actually going towards executive salaries. And like, again, paying for people is the most expensive part. But I don't think any of these projects have adequately answered the questions of like, can you prove to us that these are better welfare? Where's your funding coming from, and how are you going to maintain these animals long term? Okay. So now it's time to talk about the 5 domains. The 5 domains are housing, nutrition, veterinary care, behavioral social / training, and mental state. So I think these sanctuaries have done a good job of answering the question of housing, but I don't think they've done a good job at all at answering those other 4 domains. A lot of these sites are actually remote, so that makes getting equipment, getting trained personnel harder. Where's your funding going to come from? Where's your, like, the Sea Life Trust has been a myriad of problem after problem, and it's actually really frustrating to watch, because Little Gray and Little White, they're the 2 beluga whales, as of the beginning of this year, they've spent the majority of their time not in the sea pen, but in an indoor pool, because of a combination of weather, animal stress related, like the animals weren't adjusting well, and the aforementioned oil leak. Like, these are all things that should have been scaped out and planned out ahead of time, and I'm not sure they were, because these setbacks are pretty significant. And like I said, it's really frustrating, because as the caretakers of these animals, as the people, we brought these animals out of their natural environments, we have a responsibility to provide them the best care possible. And every single person involved, to me, regardless of whether it's a sanctuary, SeaWorld, or anyway, they are not doing their due diligence. And I'm going to come back around and talk about like the National Aquarium in Baltimore taking their sweet time and really planning it out, thinking it through. I honestly think of every party I've talked about in this entire video, I think they are the ones that we should be the most praising of. They are being very contemplative and thoughtful of every step they take. Last I checked, they've looked into, I think, 40 sites in like 4 different countries, and like that is not an insignificant effort in even just scoping out these sites. And so I think we all need to really start asking these hard questions, because these animals deserve it, and we can't skirt on them. Like, we have done them a disservice by bringing them out of the wild, and now we have to work within the problems that we've created for ourselves. And I don't think we are holding the people offering solutions with as much care and responsibility and what's the word I'm looking for? We're not holding them to the standard that they should be, you know? Editing Charles here. So I have 2 points that I'd like to go over. Point number 1 is one that I said I was going to come back to, and in the filming session I definitely thought I did, and I never did. And point number 2 is I just want to clarify myself a little bit. So point number 1 is, I think one of my biggest problems here is that we are removing choice from these animals. So just like many people have rightfully pointed out that by some situations animals are being forced to perform, we are removing their choice to engage with human interaction if and when they want to. I understand there is nuance there when it comes to training husbandry and veterinary care, and that there is actually a lot of evidence that training and the mental stimulation of it is actually beneficial for the animals. There is nuance there, but there are definitely cases where they have been forced to perform when the animal didn't want to. On the flip side, purposely structuring your environment so that they cannot or will not get human social interaction is also removing a choice from their environment. And as we've seen from Keiko, removing that choice to have the option of human interaction for an animal that was raised in the care of man can be distressing to them. And I think we need to acknowledge that and accept that maybe an animal isn't exactly like its wild counterparts, and address the fact that, as I've said many times, that we've screwed them up so bad that what's best for them isn't necessarily what feels best to us. And that is all. Point number 2, and I just want to clarify, I think some people might get the impression that I don't think seaside sanctuaries can work. And the reality is, I genuinely do. I just think that since a lot of people think that sea pens, since they're closer to the wild, are inherently better, that we've ignored some flaws in husbandry that I think need to be addressed in order for us to obtain the best care possible for these animals. That is also not to say that I think sea pens are the ideal situation. The reality is we honestly don't know. And that is like being able to admit we don't know. I think we need to be able to say that. And that's kind of the point of this whole video. So right back to your scheduled programming. So this is probably going to be my longest video thus far. I hope I made it very clear that this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I would be willing to go into each aspect of this in depth in a future video, because each facet of this is intensely fascinating to me, but there was a lot of threads to pull together for just this one in order to bring, because again, it's a complicated topic. So if this is a topic you're interested in, or you have questions that you would like me to give my perception on, please comment them below. If this is a topic that you find interesting or you thought the video was good, please comment, like, subscribe. That tells the algorithm that I did a good job and recommend this video to other people. If you think I'm way out of line, please comment below. I'd be very curious to see why you think that. I feel like I had a pretty reasonable stance here. But yeah, let's do what's best for these animals and think it through and make sure that the people who are claiming they have solutions actually have thought through and have every intention to take care of these animals as well as they can for the entire lifespan of these animals. And I don't have more to say about that. I'm sure I do, but I feel like if I keep delving into it, I will just keep rambling. So please stay curious, and please look into these topics and try to ask for more accountability from people who own or would like to own cetaceans in captive situations.